Manistee City Council work session for Tuesday, September 11, 2018 is now called to order. As we begin tonight, I would like to recognize today is the 17th anniversary of 9/11, terrorist attacks on the United States of America. Let us stand in a moment of memory to those that lost their lives, those that responded to save their lives, and those that have sacrificed in response to those attacks. May their memories comfort us and be with us and never forgotten. Thank you. Please be seated. Work session items. We have A through G. First item would be public comments on work session related items. Are there any members of the public that wish to address work session related items? Yes, sir. Please come forward, state your name and address.
4th Street. I see you're going to talk tonight about rubbish and trash in the letter E. I don't know what I got to say pertains to this, but I'd like to see it in an ordinance where people have to take their trash cans off the boulevard, put them in back or the side of their house, and get them out of the road. There's a lot of them where the trash man puts the hopper in the road. That's where it stands. They just bring their trash out of the house and throw it in that tote. Get that ugly thing out of the boulevard.
Are there any other citizens that wish to make comment?
Jim Snoik with the Vogue Theater. I made my comment at the last city council meeting, about how it'd be difficult for us to, with what you had originally mentioned for the ordinance, for the garbage ordinance. I do want to let you know that I do believe something has to be done because it is a mess. After that meeting, I think the week after that meeting, when I went outside and took our garbage out, I saw garbage blowing down the road and stuff. So I agree something needs to be done. I just hope that something can be worked out that'll be manageable by everybody on River Street.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other citizen comment? If not, we'll move on to the first agenda item. Discussion of non-union DC pension plan. Mr. Bradford.
Thank you, Mayor. Council had asked at the last work session to look at some options of what a DC plan might look like for new hires in the non-union and department head division, assuming that's the direction that council wanted to go. In your packet of information, there's a memo from me that lays out what I think would be an appropriate plan if council decided to close that defined benefit division and hires and put new hires into a defined contribution plan. I also attached copies of the presentations I had given over the past few months as we've talked about this issue. If council decides to close that division and put new hires into a DC plan, my recommendation would be that we, one, utilize our current ICMA 457 plan design as the vehicle for doing so. And then two, the matching structure would be the city would put in 3% regardless of what the employee would put in. And then we would match dollar for dollar the next 7%. So for instance, if the employee put in 7% of their salary, the city would put in a total of 10%, and the city's contribution would be capped at 10%. And that sliding scale does a couple of things. One, it gives the employee the maximum flexibility. If they don't want to put in 7% or 6% or 5%, they have the options to do that. And two, if they do put in the 7% and get the full city match, it allows them over time to accumulate assets to be able to have a reasonable level of retirement. It's also competitive with other municipalities. It gives some level of parity with the steel workers. And so that seems to make sense based on some of the benchmarking I looked at and what other communities are doing. The one thing to keep in mind is if we do move new hires into a DC division, according to MERS, we're going to pay more for about the next 20 years. And then after that, we'll have a big drop off, but then the cost will continue to escalate over time. So the other thing that does though is it reduces any unfunded liability being accrued for any new hires. So we'll still have an unfunded liability until the last person retires out of that division, but it prevents any new liabilities from being accrued. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
I'm looking at incentive with the plan you described. It doesn't seem like there's much incentive for the employee to contribute to the plan.
Oh, there's a huge incentive. I disagree with that. I get dollar for dollar matching after 3%. That's 100% return on my money. That's a huge incentive.
How does that fare with what we're spending right now?
Right now, if the city's contribution is going to be capped at 10%, so we're paying a little bit more than that for our non-union division. The normal ongoing cost of the non-union pension division is less than 10%, but because it's slightly underfunded, there's a accrued unfunded liability that we pay. So it's more than 10%. So the 10% would be less than what we're paying right now.
I would propose modeling a defined contribution after the state of Michigan defined contribution plan. They contribute 3% whether an employee contributes or not to the plan. They match the first 3% that the employee does dollar for dollar. Then they match 50 cents on the dollar the next 4% that the employee puts in. That ends up with the state contributing 8% and the employee contributing 7% with an employee option, of course, to contribute a greater amount. I think 10% city contribution is excessive. And I think, one of the things that the state looked at was as they spread the match out to a longer period of time, employees tended to contribute more into the plan. Yes, there was cost. I've looked at your information in great detail. Over a 20-year period of time, closing the plan would cost us an additional $30,000. You amortize that over a 30-year period of time, that's about $1,500 a year. The trade-off is that we eliminate the unfunded liability for that employee group. And yes, they are underfunded. They are the second most underfunded group we have in the city. I believe from the current budget, the IAFF is slightly over 60% funded, and we're about 80.2% funded for the non-union group. The 10% that you speak of, the cap on the United Steelworkers. As I understand, that was a provision of state law that was since rescinded when their contract was negotiated that capped the city's contribution to 10%. There are no other contracts or employee groups that are subject to that provision. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So right now their contributions are about 3.37% this year. As I go back and look at the history of MERS and the contributions from both the city and the employees, the Public Works group has pretty much self-funded their plan. 3.37% for a group this year, 28% for the IAFF, about 20% for the police, a little over 13% for the non-union group. There's been great disparity in the contributions from the taxpayer in relationship to the contributions from the individuals for a long period of time. I'm looking at I understand the $30,000 net cost over a 20-year period of time, but I'm looking at way down the future. I mean, our increased cost, and the cost certainly in all aspects of things with inflation, are increasing greater than our revenue is. And we continue to take from the general fund to fund these things, and it impacts our ability for street maintenance and jeopardizes services. Our most recent budget even goes so far as to make the statement that without increases in revenue growth with the expenses, that we're gonna have to look at cuts in services or reductions in personnel. I'd like to plan forward and take proactive action to avoid those things in the future.
So, there's a lot there, a few comments. You're correct that the MERS projections, and this was based on, a 7% contribution. It has a net $30,000, but until you get out to year 17, for instance, in year 5, it's gonna cost the city an additional $18,000, in year 10, an additional $27,000. So the city's costs are more every year until you get out to year 17, which you, in theory, have huge reductions, but as you know, projecting 17 years out is difficult. So I just wanna make that clear, that's why it nets to 30,000. The matching program, if council decides to close this division to new hires and open a DC is clearly a subject of debate. You asked us to bring back a structure. I brought back a structure that's understandable, that I think is fair. It's not the same as the state is, but for local municipalities, it's pretty comparable and competitive. And like I said, it kind of gives us some parity with the steel workers in terms of the maximum exposure to the city. You may have new employees under a plan like this that aren't putting in the full 7%. And so the city's contribution would be less. I think that's a reasonable number, considering it would eliminate those liabilities. But again, this is a council decision as to which direction they want to go. I was asked to bring back a plan. I discussed it with the city manager, felt that was a reasonable plan, and based on my research, I think it's a reasonable structure if that's a decision or direction that council wants to go.
One of the things that Ed and I discuss is if council wants to get rid of a defined benefit program for new general employees, we wanted to be able to offer something that, in terms of a retirement, that is still attractive and enables us to recruit good people. And that's where, our mindset was. And as Ed said, this is not out of line with what other communities are doing, and we feel that it's attractive when it will enable us to recruit and retain new employees in that division.
I think at one time too, I think you mentioned that in order, because a lot of employees may be coming from municipalities, future employees from municipalities that already have the defined pension plan, that you may have to also raise salaries for those people that are coming in to make it more attractive. You still feel that way, or?
I think our wage scale right now is competitive, but the DB is very attractive to prospective employees. And if we're going to do away with it, we want something that is a little bit better than average. It's not way above average, but we think it's enough to attract and retain new employees if council wants to go to a DC.
Mr. Bradford, what happens if I have 12 years of service with the city, and then opt to go into the private sector or somewhere else? I've contributed 4% all along of my salary. Do I get the city's contribution and my contribution? Do I get the full value of my package when I leave the city, or do I get a diminished package?
So if I'm vested in the current DB pension plan, and I leave the city, my benefit is based on the same formula, based on my years of service, and it's called a deferred vested pension. And I'll receive that when I reach, in our case, 60 years old as the normal retirement age. So it's a deferred vested pension. The employee has the right to forego that and take out their contributions, the city contributions. If I left the pension plan before I was vested, I could take out my contributions plus a little bit of interest, but I would not get the city contributions.
But with a defined contribution, the employee takes everything, and they're typically shorter. I know when I worked for the state, it was a 2-year vesting period for the state, as opposed to where we have 10 years in some plans.
Yeah, and I would suggest no vesting period if we did that. I think it's, you put the money in, you get it, the employee. I don't think vesting periods on a defined contribution plan make any sense, in my opinion.
I think some points to a defined contribution that some people overlook is that this is the employee's resources. So should I have an emergency or have a situation, within tax codes and such, I'm able to borrow against that money. I can't do that against bills.
That's correct. One thing we would lose for that division if you did go to a defined contribution plan is for employees that are vested and, in some instances possibly not vested, they do have a long-term disability component of that. So for instance, if I were to somehow have a long-term disability, I would still get some kind of a benefit. So our long-term disability has been based on MERS. We don't offer a long-term disability plan. So by going to a deferred or defined contribution plan, that benefit would no longer be there, and I doubt we would, buy some kind of a long-term disability plan. It would be a little bit of a reduction from that perspective. With that said, I don't believe we've ever had any retiree go out on a MERS disability retirement. It doesn't happen very.
We'll look back at the history, and I'm going to talk about general as opposed to just the non-union group. I look back at the history. I got bored one day, so I sat back and looked at some numbers in budgets and audits. From 2006 through 2016, the city contributed roughly $1.76 million into MERS. During that period of time, when we started out, 2005 in MERS, we were 108% funded in our city's pension plan. But during this period of time, this 12 years putting 1.76 million in, we incurred an unfunded liability. Looking forward from that, the 2017 through 2021, the projections at the time I did this research showed the city contributing another $2 million in the next 4 years. So it took 12 years to put 1.76 in, and it's only going to take 4 years to incur a cost of over $2 million into the plan. Do you think that is viable going forward when we look at those kinds of increases?
Well, I'll make a couple comments. Had we not gone to MERS, our contributions would have been a lot more, because in our previous pension plan, we were invested differently. We had lower rate of return assumptions, and they would have been more. We were paying more in the prior pension plan. Now, with that said, it's been 10 years since we've been to MERS or more, and I'm not an actuary. But the savings that the city accrued over that time, the contributions, the 170-some thousand that we were making in the old pension plan wouldn't have stayed there. They would have also have risen. So we've had this differential that the city's benefited from every year. Even though the contributions now are higher than what they were 10 or 12 years ago, that wouldn't be what they are today. So going to MERS has absolutely been beneficial. Every pension plan that went through the 2008 Great Recession, which is the worst stock market performance since the Great Depression, has had dramatic decreases in funding. But these are long-term plans, and the long-term MERS rate of return has exceeded what their expectations are. I fully expect that MERS will lower their rate of return going forward because there's a lot of pressure to do so, and it's a more conservative thing. So that's going to happen. That might tend to drive up and increase our contributions. The one thing the city has done on all of our plans is we paid the full impact of the experience study that was done 5 years ago. They gave communities the opportunity of either phasing that in over 5 years or doing it all up front. We did it all up front, so it made a big impact on the budget in the first year, but then it's less every year, and those resources that are going in allow that money to work longer and be invested longer and hopefully drive down that unfunded liability. A lot of communities are making additional payments above and beyond what's required if they're concerned about that. But I think it's a little bit misleading to focus on this period of a horrible stock market that is a once in a probably a lifetime occurrence when a pension plan has a 50-year time horizon or more. With that said, though, with a DC plan, you have no danger of having an unfunded liability. That's clear.
What is our unfunded liability right now?
Oh, I don't have that right in front of me. It's
3, 4 million?
Yeah, it depends on how it's measured. There's several different ways to measure that. I can get you the number. I don't have.
The budget, it's 3.2 as of the budget published.
What's it projected to be then?
It could very well go up, but it depends on what the market does. We're paying. There's two components of a pension plan. There's the normal ongoing costs. The city pays that. Plus, they amortize this unfunded accrued liability. And the way they're doing it now is they amortize that over a fixed period of years. So if all the other actuarial calculations and assumptions are met and you pay that off, that unfunded liability will be paid off over that amortization period. Every year it takes 1 year off of it. It used to be MERS and most pension plans rolled that amortization period, so it's like a mortgage that you never pay off. This is something that's got a date certain where the funding is supposed to adjust to get that liability down to zero. So yes, our contributions from the city have gone up, and they've gone up relatively steeply. And if they make more adjustments with the rate of return, that could negatively impact it. But I believe overall, we're gonna see that start to level off somewhat. Now, if there's a huge stock market crash and it's prolonged, then that'll impact things. If the bull market continues, that positively impacts things. It's kind of like a budget. These actuarial projections are the best information they have available based on a whole bunch of assumptions, and that changes the next day depending on conditions. It's like our budget. We base it on a bunch of assumptions, and facts and circumstances change.
Well, I struggle with two things, or one thing in particular is just, as a taxpayer of the city of Manistee, what is my obligation to ensure somebody a retirement when they retire as an employee, a city employee? I struggle with that. I don't know why, I just do. I don't know what the obligation is. I hear it said by Mr. Taylor that it's important that we have good paying jobs, good retirements, so we can attract good people. I have a tendency to disagree with that a little bit. I think our pay scale is good, and if we have a decent retirement, we'll attract people. It's a beautiful place to live.
Councilmember Zielinski, I think that's a case-by-case basis. I know of a couple people that are current employees that would not be here if we did not have a defined benefit plan that we've hired recently. So I think it depends. I think the program that I've laid out here, if that's the direction the council wants to go, is attractive and probably wouldn't impact that very much. But I know for a fact that there's at least 2 people that wouldn't be here if we didn't have that DB plan.
I guess, in the spirit of moving this along, we've offered our recommendation to council. If council is looking at something different, please let us know. Give us some ideas where, if you don't like what we presented, please give us some feedback on what we can change and move this forward.
Well, I'll just make one more comment, and then I won't talk about it anymore, Mr. Bradford, but I have a tendency to read the budget and read what you've said for the past few years in the budget. At what point do we start recognizing that we need to step off a curb and not a cliff and start making some adjustments in what we do?
Well, I think we've been making adjustments all along, and let me be clear, I'm not advocating one way or another on this. I'm just trying to present objective facts. If we close the DB plan to new hires and go to a DC plan, I think what we've laid out here is easy to implement, it's competitive, can be done relatively quickly. It raised costs on the city in the short term and the medium term and the shorter long term. Overall, it will reduce any increase in that unfunded liability for new hires. And I want to be clear on that. It's not to say that the unfunded liability for the existing people in the plan may go up or may go down, but there will be no new liability created for new hires because, of course, they'll be in the DC plan.
Well,
if that's what council decides
I think
to do.
we need to look forward and look at the next generations that are coming and make plans for that. It's just not all about today for me. It's about what's down the road.
I understand that. It will put, but your question was about the immediate budgets. It will put additional pressure on the budget because the costs will go up in the short term.
I'm pretty comfortable with the proposed city plan. I just thought it was a bit overly generous, but I'm okay with that.
Okay.
If you want to stay with ICMA and MERS as administrator, I mean, that would be kind of a staff choice. I think there are other options out there. I was under different programs with State Street Finance when I worked for the state of Michigan. But whatever is easiest to administer here would be something I'd be comfortable with. But I would certainly like to move to defined contribution.
And if that's the consensus of council, then we need to hear that. Then we can put it on the next council agenda for your action.
Or
I want nothing.
2 council agendas out possibly, depending on timing of stuff.
Right, yeah.
Just, if you're asking, I want nothing to do with this.
Okay,
That's my consensus.
okay.
I believe that we have to look to the future and do something about it. And I do favor the defined contribution plan over the pension that we have. Except I would be very reluctant to vote yes on a proposal for this unless it said in the motion that that we would be going to this defined contribution plan and still using ICMA as the funding.
Well, I thank you, because I'm pretty passionate about that issue, because I was adversely affected in another community. I was in a 457 plan, and went to another employer, and they didn't have it, so I couldn't maintain it. I couldn't. So what we see as ICMA is pretty much the standard in the municipal arena, and that's why we are very passionate about keeping ICMA for our DC plan.
Does ICMA offer counseling and that type of thing for their?
I do believe so.
Yeah, they have a whole variety of services. They're a huge company. They've got retirement modelers where you can put in all kinds of information. You can talk to the representative. They have years to retirement dated funds. They've got a wide selection. Their fees are very competitive. We negotiated a fee reduction about a year ago. So there's a lot of good things going for that. Our employees are very comfortable with it. It's what we've been with since Ben Byfoss was here and brought it in. We didn't have it before he started, so it's been here since 1987, 88, something like that.
Well,
And it's real easy to just flip a switch and, if we go to this direction, to move that way.
I'm fairly comfortable with defined contributions. I was in that plan with the state, and it served me well, so I'm not afraid of it.
I'm okay with this plan. I know it's a little generous too. I agree with Smith, but I'm okay with it if we go forward with it.
Okay, well, I don't know if we'll make the next council agenda, but no later than the first meeting in October.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next item, discussion on Banso committee update.
Yes. Do you want me to put it as a slide?
Good evening. So earlier this year, the Salt City Rock and Blues came before council and asked permission to start fundraising for a potential future project, which could be a permanent stage down at First Street Beach. So we just put together a few slides just to let you know kind of what's been happening with that. It was mentioned in the article when they held their Labor Day Fest, and there was a rendering in there, so we thought it appropriate to bring council up to speed. This whole concept really started back when the beach master plans or conceptual plans were put together back in July of 2008. There were plans that were put together for both First Street Beach, Fifth Avenue, and Man-Made Lake, and the focus group for those consisted of representatives from all the different public bodies, Planning Commission, Parks Commission, City Council. There was representation from various groups like the JCs, the Elks, Rotary, and we also had quite a few students from the local high schools that participated. If you look, does this have a pointer? Or maybe you can circle it with the mouse. Towards the top, there's a kind of a blue rectangle, and this was suggested by the.
I don't think you can see it on the screen, can you?
Right up in there.
There you go.
At one point during the focus group discussion, the kids said, we would love to have a place where we could go to the beach and dance, and a lot of other people in the room kind of scuffed at it and curled a lip at it. And I actually think Mr. Horkel was on that group and said, wait a minute, I remember when I was a kid, there was a place at the end of First Street Beach that used to sell bait, and they used to have dances on the weekends down there, and a lot of people in the community went, oh my gosh, I remember that. So it got incorporated into the the conceptual plan. And over the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion, especially around the Forest Festival, when the stages are being set up. Those stages can cost anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 and up just to rent a stage for that 3 or 4 day process. So the Rock and Blues group said, you know what, it would be wonderful if we had something permanent and if we could do some fundraising towards that cause and not have to pay the reoccurring. So a new committee was put together that had representation from the city, the Chamber of Commerce, the Port City Rock and Blues, Manistee Community Foundation, the Shoreline Showcase. Again, we included some local students and a couple local business representatives, the Ramsdale Center for Regional Arts, and then the Spicer Group has really been helping us kind of facilitate that, and Integrated Architecture has assisted with coming up with concepts and planning. A lot of the discussion items were, if a permanent facility were constructed, where would that be located? What type of uses could it be available for? What kind of maintenance impacts and ongoing costs would be incurred by the city or whoever was responsible for it? What existing infrastructure is in place that could be utilized and capitalized on? And then is there a potential revenue stream or economic development community? So based on all that, and this group has been meeting every couple months for almost a year now, and the site that was discussed and kind of stood out was the vacant area. Some of you remember it used to be called the kite flying area, but it's basically between the Stub Pier and First Street Pier. Right now it's primarily a flat grassy area surrounded with some small dune and vegetation. But one of the unique things about this is we have a massive existing parking lot that really gets used heavily in the month or towards the end of August, early September, when the salmon are starting to run. But for the most part, and except for during the 4th of July or tight lines for troops, that parking lot remains underutilized. So we have a vacant spot, we've got parking adjacent to it. So a site plan was put together kind of envisioning what possibly could be constructed there. And this concept really simply has an outdoor stage, which is a fixed structure. You see kind of the arched areas. That would be a sloped lawn area that would have handicap accessibility. The concept there would be, it would be very easy to maintain. It would simply be mowing the grass. There may be a section where it could have some permanent seating for VIP or such, but this would give access to people to bring their own chairs, be able to lay out a blanket, bring their strollers, and not just during concert times, but when there wasn't any type of concert or show, it could be open to just general park use. The orientation of it, and as we get down the road in this, we can get in more detail of it, but the orientation of this really was focused on, this would be one of the only places along the shoreline of Lake Michigan where there would be a venue like this that would be on the lake, that would have a view of the pier heads, and it also is uniquely situated where the sunsets from Memorial Day to Labor Day are right within the viewing corridor of all the seating that's within that. This is another view of it, and as it looks out over the harbor. Just another angle looking more to the northwest.
What's the seating capacity? Just curious, do you have any idea?
It's about 2,000, the way that it's laid out here. So really the next steps would be to complete a feasibility study, and some of the main items in that feasibility study are, is there a market for different concert venues? So Shoreline Showcase, certainly they would love to have their Tuesday night concerts down there, and this would work out really big, but they don't need 2,000 seats for that. During the Forest Festival or during Labor Fest when there's bands playing, that would be a good venue for those type of activities. Is 2,000 the right size? Does it need to be bigger, smaller? Or if we had, several times during the summertime where we brought in a pretty large artist and could sell seating, and is 2,000 the right size for that? So the feasibility study would really look at the economics of what does it cost to build this, what are the different possible ways that grant funding or other sources of revenue could fund this, and then what are the long-term financial impacts of it? What's the cost of ongoing maintenance, and could it be a revenue stream for the future? Preliminary discussions show that it could be. It actually could be a revenue stream while also being a permanent year-round asset for the community. So we've got some ideas within the committee. I think one of them was possibly reaching out to MEDC to see if we could fund that feasibility study. Nothing's been set in stone at this point.
And it might be something that we could get some assistance with through Project Rising Tide. But there's a lot, we've had some very free-flowing discussions in our committee. One of the discussions early on, or not early on, recently was, working with the Ramsdale Regional Center for Arts to manage that, especially for the big concerts, and looking at this as an economic development concept for this community. So we've had a lot of things, discussions like that, but one of the things is we didn't want to have this just reserved for those large concerts, and Jeff alluded to it, that, smaller concerts that we're already familiar with, and then when it's not in use, it's a park. You can go in there, sit, have lunch if you want, have a picnic. There's a wide open area in front. You can go down there and throw a Frisbee or whatever, and we want it to be used, all during the good season, even when it's not as a concert venue. So that's the committee's vision. So again, this is just a real brief overview, and more details to come, as they say.
There's no estimates on cost yet?
Just some really, really general costs, maybe about, 3 million, 3.5, but that includes also, we factored in infrastructure, improvements along that corridor, redoing the parking lot, reconfiguring it. There was a lot of things. But, it all comes back to what Jeff says is a feasibility study. And if we need to know, can it support itself? Because that's the only way that it's viable. That if we have the big concerts, they're going to have to pay their own way. And we don't want to subsidize it.
And the discussion has been, no matter what it costs, it has to, the sources of funding need to be able to pay for that. It's not necessarily something that we're looking to go into debt to build, or even have to take out of the general fund if necessary, but something that we think that and through all the discussions that we've had, that through different endowments and grant funds that are out there, it may be able to be built and match, with other sources. So
You did mention maintenance on one of your lists there.
mm-hmm.
But that looks like it could be a huge maintenance issue. Is that group going to take that over? Is the city going to take that over? Talked about that at all?
Well, this would be a city project, and this is just preliminary stuff. This is not a project that we're here pitching, selling. This is just kind of the summary of the discussion to date. If the Ramsdale were a party to this and did the scheduling and stuff for those large events, surely there's a lot of cleanup that occurs after those. You also have to hire security. Those events would need to be profitable enough where those costs are covered in it. But the daily maintenance is really grass cutting, possibly some irrigation. I don't see that as big ticket items. What we've discussed as far as materials, and one of the reasons why the cost would be high initially, is there's a lot of concrete in there. So, that concrete's got many decades of life in it. It's not something that would need to be replaced on an annual basis. The overhead structure, what is being, and I didn't bring all the slides that would discuss the materials and stuff, but it would be made of materials that would be maintenance friendly and, wouldn't have to be painted and redone every few years. So the maintenance aspect is something that we've kept in mind very strongly so that we don't create a boat anchor for us.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item D, discussion on street plan. Got my name on it.
Well, you're the one that requested it
Yeah.
be on the agenda.
But, I guess I have some questions, and all the right people are here. Jeff and city engineer. We had a SAW grant, okay? And we went out and televised, I'm guessing, the majority of the sewer lines.
Yes.
So we should have a pretty good idea of what needs maintenance and what's most critical and such. And I know we're focused on the SSO 18 event
Mm-hmm.
and the cap and all that stuff. We also have phaser ratings for all of our streets. And we just completed a recertification of Act 51 for funding from the state. Our question is why we can't put a list of streets together with a phaser rating with those streets, and possibly if, and I use an example, the section of street between Division and US 31 on First Street that was just milled and filled and some curb and gutter work done. I mean, for example, I don't know what the rating would be on it now, 9 or 10. It should be pretty good.
Today it's a 10, yep.
So we could put that section of street and put the phaser rating in a column as a 10. We've got known sewer or water work, utility work to do there, and the last action on it was milled and filled 2018.
Correct.
I think we've got the pieces of all of this in different places. We just have not gone through the effort of putting it together. So if Councilmember Cooper is interested in looking up what's the rating on his street? When's the last time it was done? Is there any upcoming utility work on that street? This is not necessarily to result in an expectation of someone because their phaser rating is 4 or 5. Then you go over to the column and utility work, yes, there is some utility work to be done. And you have to coordinate the funding of utility work with the street maintenance funds that we have going along. But something that just provides a better picture to people on the condition of their street, what else might be a factor in that street. And I mean, it's easy to explain to people that, we got to a point last year which candidate streets being taken care of, that we had $90,000 left. We didn't have enough to do 1,100 feet of this street. We had enough left to do, 120 feet on this street, and it wasn't the worst street, but that's what we had the available funds for. And when you have a contractor in here with all their equipment and the weight limits on the roads and stuff are lifted and stuff, it's prudent to act in that behalf. And I think that's all I'm not asking for a 20-year plan.
Yeah, so.
Asking for consolidation of information that people can refer to.
Yep. So I'm glad that you open it up that way. So what we've done is put together a very generic PowerPoint, but the reason why I wanted Rich sitting at the computer is because we have all the information that you're asking for, and we've been using that on an annual basis, but it's a lot of data, and as opposed to showing a snapshot of it, I'd like him to open up some of those files so that you can see where it is. And then I'd like to just talk about a little bit about how we use all that data and how we, on an annual basis, update our transportation improvement plan, how some of those priorities and those decisions are made. And then I'm sure it happens to you guys where people say, well, how come you didn't choose my street segment? And I have people calling me all the time asking those same questions. The advantage I have is I've got the databases I can go back to and say, well, when I look at the map, I see that there's $200,000 worth of water main work that has to be done. So, so we'll explain some of that, okay?
Okay. It's just the same as I just had some brush picked up. They had someone else say they picked your brush up and took care of it. Why didn't you get mine?
Mm-hmm.
I said, did you call and get it scheduled? No. So I understand.
Yep. And I will mention that we just spent $200. We're gonna have lettering put on the side of that brush truck that says, to schedule your brush pickup, please call, and we'll have the DPW number. I thought it was a pretty inexpensive investment, but maybe helps get that message out there.
Did you just get a grant like the chief did?
He's gonna share some of that with us. So, the city street network, just again, some high-level reminder stuff, consists of almost 49 miles of, I think we're actually just over 49 miles when the next Act 51 map is recertified, because we added a bunch of segments to it, if you recall, this summer. It's split between both major and minor streets. So about 3 weeks ago, Mayor Smith asked me after the meeting, how many streets are there in the street network? Well, there's 48 miles, there's 134 streets in the entire street network. We don't manage and use First Street, which is a great example. I'm gonna use, we've been talking about First Street, we're gonna actually demonstrate 12th Street.
Okay.
But if you think about First Street, starting at 7th Street on the east end, that was reconstructed all the way to US 31 when the sewers were separated in 1998. So they got a full reconstruction, and now it's 20 years old. The next segment is the mill and fill we just did this year from 31 to Division Street. So now that's got a Paisley rating of 10, really needs no work today. The segment from Division Street to Maple Street was actually completed in 1995 as a sewer separation project. And 2 years ago in 17, we did the microsurface over that. So that's got a whole different character to it. The segment from Maple Street down to Pine Street was through a 1998 sewer separation project and has received different treatments. The segment below that was a 1999 sewer separation project, and that received some different treatments with the slurry seal. The section from Spruce down to just about the top of the hill where the armory is was part of the 2000, was that 11 or 12, Roger, when we separated the sewers in front of your house? I think that was 12.
Yeah, I think it was 12.
So that was all reconstructed at that point, and last year we just did the first round of crack sealing on that. And I believe it was the next year or later that fall, we did the segment from the armory all the way to the west end. So the way that we actually manage the street network is not by street, but by segment. So we go block to block in every block in the city, and there's 671 of those segments. And you're absolutely correct. We do Paisley ratings on an annual basis for every one of those segments. We've been using a database called RoadSoft. Well, these are a little bit out of order from where I'm talking, but this is some of the documented work that we've done on the streets since 1993. And that's important because we actually have a computer software program that was developed in conjunction with the state of Michigan called RoadSoft. RoadSoft takes our Act 51 map and it breaks it into those segments that we're talking about. And so for every one of those segments, I'm not sure if this one or this one shows it better. This one shows a lot of information, just trying to zoom in a little bit, but it's got the street, it's got the segment from start to finish. It classifies with the Paisley rating. It has the classification of whether it's a local or a major street or a minor or major. The width of that street, the length of that segment. So, it calculates and stores all that information, and all that gets updated on an annual basis.
On the right-hand side is when it talks about the last activity, last time it was resurfaced.
Right.
Activity date, yeah.
So we started using this software. Did we start using that before the asset management plan a couple years before?
Right, in conjunction with it, so probably 2008.
I was going to say probably 10 to 12 years ago we started using this. but I wasn't employed by the city, but I was working as a city's engineer at the time. And Ed and I went back all the way to '93 and all the capital projects that we had done on streets before that, and we backloaded data into this as far back as we knew. So we've probably got about 2/3 of the streets in our network where we can go back to when the last treatment was. And then every single year, whether we crack seal it, mill and fill it, reconstruct it, it gets put in there. And then the software actually gives us a very interesting tool because it compares how much you spent on that treatment and what treatment you did. And then it watches how the Paiser ratings change after that. So it creates a deterioration curve. So based on Manistee, Michigan, and the weather that we encounter and the freeze-thaw cycles, we can put in that, or we can project out that if we do a mill and fill on this street or we do a full reconstruction, it'll give us what we think will be the pavement life of that. And sometimes it goes better than that projection, sometimes it goes less. But that's how we forecast a lot of that. So again, and this is just a snapshot of Paiser, but it covers all, whatever I said, 670 some segments. In addition to that, we have also, so we can pull a lot of information out of that. We can pull all the different treatment methods, so the various Paiser ratings, I don't know if they've got them listed there, but 9 and 10s, usually don't require anything. 7s and 8s, let's say, are candidates for crack sealing, and we've got crews out there crack sealing right now. And then we drop into the light rehab, the heavy rehab, and then the reconstruction phases. We also, so the picture on the upper left are heavy rehab candidates. And you're classifying that as reconstruction, right? Heavy rehab?
Heavy rehab would be
Mill and fill, okay. So when we do the heavy rehab, now we're investing some pretty large dollars into that, this thing's touchy, into that street segment. So one of the first things we do is say, okay, when we've got a heavy rehab, well, let me even back up from that. When we put together the transportation improvement plan, and it's a 3 to 5 year plan that we've got right now, on an annual basis, what we start with is how much money do we have, okay? And so let's just say that that's $800,000 this year. We look, how can we leverage that? So is there any grant money that we can get out of MDOT? Is there another project that we can leverage? Say a developer wants to do an improvement and we can tack onto that. So how can we turn those dollars and spread those out the furthest? We also look at, and this is what an example is, what other water and sewer project upgrades are necessary. So a good example is if we had to do a water main replacement and that water main has to impact part of that road, but the utility only cares about replacing that pipe and a trench above it. So what we've been doing is that utility upgrade has a cost to do an improvement, but we also want to replace all the road at the same time and take advantage of that project. So then we match some of those utility monies with it. And we also look for any other opportunities that are out there to leverage it. When there's monies left over in any given year, then we try to go to the light rehab, the crack sealing, and we put money into that. We try to look for, are there candidates that we could do the light rehab or the medium, which is the crack or the things like the microsurfacing. And then the next tier, and we've been getting pretty deep into that since we've added more money added to it the last few years, is getting into the mill and fill projects. And then as you recall, council put $200,000 from the oil and gas, dedicated it specifically to a reconstruct on a local project. And we brought that back to you, brought maps, showed you all the candidates, the dollar amounts. I even offered if you guys wanted to pick it, go ahead. But once you get to that level, there's 50 candidates, and there's nothing really magical that picks one candidate over the next. The reason why we picked that block of Hugh Street and then wrapping around was because that area of the north side, they've got lots of bad roads. There's worse roads than those, actually. Hastings is one of the worst. It barely has any pavement left. But underneath Hastings, we have to upgrade utilities. So while you gave us money for the street improvement, we didn't have money for the utilities below that. So we picked some locations that didn't have utility upgrades that we could impact the roads. And we picked that particular project because when we analyzed, it's got surface flooding, and when we analyzed where we could access the storm sewer and have capacity and extend from it, that was the starting point. So hopefully, from that point, we can continue to improve the roads, continue to extend the storm sewer so we can help some of those drainage problems. The picture on the lower right, and all those colors that you see are all things that we have identified through our water asset management and through this sanitary sewer asset management as areas where there's utility upgrades that are required. And so you're absolutely correct. When there's available money in the utilities to do a capital upgrade on a pipeline, then we want to match the road money on that and make the most out of that. This is just literally a very small piece of the transportation improvement plan. And Rich, can you pull up the actual spreadsheet that has all of our street data in it? While he's doing that, I also want to show you that even though in RoadSoft we have all that information, the engineers have actually taken all that information, imported it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then into that Excel spreadsheet, we've identified the likely treatment method, the cost of that treatment method, and we update those every year. So we're following state databases or even projects that we've bid out so that we can kind of forecast out. Can you like literally show me that whole thing and then scroll down and, or is that 12th Street segment?
This is all 671
Okay.
segments.
So it is literally 700 and some lines long of data. And so when we get down to, we've got available money to be able to upgrade and do a mill and fill, we pour through this data, we filter it so that it gives us the candidates. We then filter out, we don't have utility money, so you've got to give us candidates that don't have utility money. And then we create a map that shows us where those candidates are. And quite frankly, we try to group them so that we can have several segments located together to keep the efficiency of the contractor there. But then we also try to spread them around to the different areas of the city to make sure that, the work is being improved everywhere. Can you show the 12th Street segments, if you can find them?
Yep.
We talked about First Street, I just verbally did it, but 12th Street is pretty interesting. Every one of those lines on there is one of the segments of 12th Street. And if you go over to almost to the right-hand side where Rich is showing you, it shows those are the last Payzer ratings. So you can see that there are segments that range from 2 all the way up to 10. And so it's really difficult to try to manage a street from one end to the other. So if you think about 12th Street, it starts at literally Lake Michigan and it runs east all the way to Manistee Lake. And there's some gaps in it, but that's why we manage it by the segment. Can you go back to the PowerPoint? It's not advancing now. This is just shows you the work that's been completed really since that ad hoc street committee report came back out and council has put more emphasis on it. So all the street segments that you see that are colored is work that has been done in the past 4 years. These are projects that are in the current budget year. So we've got $2.1 million of street improvements that'll be completed. And we are leveraging about $800,000, was it 8? Out of the street funds themselves.
Yeah, it was,
This thing is touchy.
about half of it was 2 million and about half of it.
You doing that or am I?
You are.
The point is that we leveraged grant money from the state of Michigan. We've got $375,000 that'll be a small urban grant to upgrade 12th Street. We're leveraging the pipelines for our wet weather corrective action program. So we've got some conveyance that'll improve a section, little small part of 5th Street, a block of Ramsdale, several blocks of 6th Street, and a little bit of High Street. What else do we have in there? Yep, we were, I didn't even touch a button. We also are making an application for a category F to upgrade some of the streets near Morton Salt, segment of 6th Street and this 2 blocks of Engelman out to 8th Street. So we're always trying to leverage those and stretch those dollars out. So, but in order for us to reach out beyond that 3 to 5 year planning period is very difficult, because these are not assets that once you pave it, you can stop and move on to the next one. They're deteriorating on an annual basis. So by the time you get 10, 15 years out, you're back into capital improvements on that same street segment. So it's very hard to forecast that out. The engineers did look at if council were able to give us every dollar we needed to upgrade every segment in the entire network. Today that would be about $21 million. And
That number doesn't include utilities, correct?
it does not include the utilities
So it's
below
probably
them.
closer to 40. It
Right.
might be all the way.
So we maintain those databases. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of information. If you've got somebody that's got a specific question, it's something that we can go back and look at. You know, I get a lot of questions on, well, why haven't you fixed 8th Street right off the highway? Well, that's actually in the transportation improvement plan, and we're waiting for that major street money to build up after we fix 12th Street. 12th Street, we were able to get grant money, so that's got a little higher priority. Any other questions, or hopefully we answered the ones that you posed?
Well, I think I was looking for pretty much what you've got. It's just I didn't know you had it, so. And I knew individually we had the data. I mean, we've got Act 51, we've mapping, we've got phaser ratings, we've got utility overlays,
Yep.
Stuff like that. I'm just thinking, you know, when people understand where they stand, you know, if Mr. Taylor says, you know, what's the condition of my street, and how do I stand in relationship to the others? We know how many are in poor condition. We know how many are in fair condition. We know from the ad hoc committee that $600,000 a year is needed for street maintenance, and I'm not talking about salting and plowing and stuff, but just to maintain the condition of the streets. We need to find somehow, some way to get more than that, so we can actually start making some improvement on some of these streets.
Well, and you're absolutely correct, and let me just explain that for anybody that's watching. But when you look at a street network as a whole, we look at remaining service life. So those deterioration curves that I talked about project out that we expect this segment of road to last 15 years before it needs a major treatment or before it goes down to a 3 phaser rating. But it was built 5 years ago. So we've got 10 years of remaining service life on that. So every time we do any type of investment in the street network, crack sealing gives you 1 year of service life back on that street segment. Mill and fill may give you 10 years. A reconstruction may give you 15 years. So that investment, and I think it was $650,000, was the amount of money we needed to put into the street network following the asset management concepts to keep the remaining service life even. And so every dollar we put in more of that, we're leveraging it to get higher. We've worked with developers. When the development comes in, we look to leverage money. We're always looking for grant money. We're looking for ways to partner it, treatments, you know, always trying to stretch that out.
With all that being said, and I asked this question before, and I just wonder if anything has changed. At our current rate that we're putting into streets, will we ever get them all fixed?
I probably won't.
By the time we keep the good streets and fair streets good, takes a
I
while.
don't think it's at all possible without substantially more investment in the street network.
So do we have a plan for some of those streets that are really, really bad?
Well, the plan is to leverage the utility upgrades, and one of the things that we're doing with, you know, the SAW grant collected all that data. Now the engineers are putting that into, creating those spreadsheets and those databases, just like we have in Payzer. And we've got to leverage stuff. We've got to leverage these projects together and try to take advantage of it. That's really the only way that we're gonna take big chunks of it away.
I've been doing a lot of driving around and just checking out the streets, and in some areas, I'm embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
And they just keep getting worse. It seemed like there should be something, and I mentioned this before, even turning back to gravel if we had to, and putting something on them to make them hard would be better than what they are now. Some of them have huge potholes. And
Yeah, well, I mentioned Hastings. Hastings is that way. And when we just had that 8 inches of rain, we literally had trenches because there's areas where the asphalt's missing. We went back, added gravel to it. We put a bunch of cold patch on it, but it's difficult to plow snow on it because they're so bad. The answer to that street is we need to fix the utilities below it, and then we can afford to fix the street above it. You know, we need to match those together. The one thing that we're going through right now, though, is we forecasted out what we're comfortable with as far as capital improvements on the utilities. But until we close on the loans and finish building the basin and the new headworks to the plant and the conveyance, and we get through that, and then see how all those costs, you know, kind of tail out over into the future, then we'll have a better feel on how much more we can invest. But right now, we're holding back a little bit on that to make sure that we can afford everything.
At one time you mentioned Veterans Drive, and when MDOT come through and paved that, how quickly that deteriorated because they didn't
Right.
do the undersurface.
So I'm so happy you brought that up, and I didn't prompt you for this. But so what happened is, and that was probably 8 years ago or so, MDOT did some capital improvements on the Memorial Bridge and wanted to run the detour through there. That road was in poor condition. They agreed to pay 100% to mill it and fill it, but they didn't fix the base material below it. So we got a brand new road, and it only lasted 5 years, and it started cracking and potholing. Now it's in poor condition. And this is really a good example. So when the development was proposed at the Olson property, we internally, staff took the opportunity to research grant funding, and we thought if that project moved forward, that would make us eligible for grant funding to pay for a large portion of that reconstruction project. In the city portion, we were gonna fund that through our current street funds, but then have been recaptured through the TIF money available from the brewery and the Edgewater project.
Now, is that, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jeff, is that street, did it deteriorate at the rate it did because of the use it has?
It's a function of the use, but it's more about the base material underneath it. So whenever we do a mill and fill, we core those streets and we make sure that what's below it can support the new pavement. Otherwise, it's just throwing it away.
So if we took some of these really, really bad streets and we put a thin layer of asphalt on there, how long would it last?
Depending on how bad the base was, you may get 6 to 8 years of life on it before it would turn back to cracked and potholing again.
But it would be slow, and because they don't get used as heavy as Veteran Drive.
Right. Let me come back to that, but let me finish the memorial story. So I actually had a meeting with MDOT last Friday, and they just sent out a press release today. But again, they're going to do some capital improvements on the 31 bridge, and they're looking at doing a 3-day detour. They did the same thing 2 years ago in October. They did the north side, now they're going to do the work on the south side. And so they want to use the same detour route. So I cautioned them and said, look, that little segment can't handle that traffic. We can make it survive for 3 days, and I can patch it and maintain it. But the next time you do a big capital project, you're going to have to invest in it, and it's just not a mill and fill, it's a full reconstruction. So they actually have one planned for 2023, 5 years from now. And so they've asked me to document what it would cost and what those requirements are. So we're going to try to leverage state money to not just improve that segment, but possibly even do some treatments on the other portions of that. Washington Street would be the next big one. So we're trying to leverage some state money to be able to do that. 5 years ago, when they did another detour like this, we got them to pay for the mill and fill of Monroe Street from Washington to 31. So, you know, we're trying to leverage those partners as well. But back to your question, that's how this street network was managed for decades, is we would take those bad streets, we'd put an overlay on them, and then we'd move on to the next one. And what we find is that within, you know, 5 to 10 years, they go back and are just as bad as they were, and we're not really having a beneficial impact on the overall network.
So what is the plan for those streets that may never get touched? What do we plan to do with them?
Well, I wouldn't say we don't plan on ever touching them. What I'm saying is that they're not able to be projected within the current tip because there's just not enough money to fund that at this time.
So how far are we looking out? A year, 5 years, 10 years?
Right now in our tip, we're looking out 3 to 5.
It's hard for me to accept that there isn't something we can do for the people that have been going with, basically without a good street for years.
And it's, the street ad hoc committee had the same conclusion. It's gonna take more money to be able to do that.
Councilmember Zunsky and Council, I just want to make a couple of comments. We're going to be redoing the 5-year update for the asset management plan, and RoadSoft has added some capabilities, and Sean and Rich are much more familiar with it now. So the asset management plan will look a little bit different and probably have some more analytical stuff in it. So that $600,000 number that's been thrown out there is going to change, I guess is my point. What is it going to take to maintain this? But from my perspective, given the level of funding, resources that are currently available, and which includes the increase projected that we're going to get from MDOT, we will never get there. And this is what the Street Ad Hoc Committee said: we need to raise more revenue. We need more resources, and those resources can come from one of 3 areas, in my well, maybe 4. One is the state actually fixes the transportation issue and sends us even more funds than they already are, because the fix that they did, that anybody whose objective has looked at, is inadequate. It was a Band-Aid and it didn't raise enough money. So it either has to come from the state, or we have to raise the resources locally. And in order to raise the resources locally, we have to raise water and sewer rates to accelerate the under-street infrastructure that we're gonna do. And we probably need to pass a Headley override, because absent service level changes in the general fund, there's no dollars to continue to put into streets. We can't continue to increase that. Now, there will be some money available when the city hall bond is paid off, and those resources could be allocated partially to streets. But in order to close that gap, to close that 20 million or 40 million, you've got to have more resources. You can't do it with existing resources. It's not possible.
And respectfully, I think if you would have asked that each year for the past 50 years, the answer wouldn't have changed. But using the asset management program the additional money that you've put in, the additional funds that we've got from the state, leveraging every opportunity, we've got further than I think we've ever been.
Well, if I was a taxpayer on some of those streets, I'd be pretty disappointed that I wouldn't live long enough to ever see my street fixed, and I'm paying taxes. I just find that very hard to accept. I don't want to dwell on it. It just doesn't seem, some of those streets, Jeff, and I'm sure you're aware,
I'm aware.
are very, very bad. I mean, you don't even want to drive your car down them, and if it wasn't for potholes, there'd be no street at all. I'm done.
Well, we all inherited this, and we're doing our best to take it as far as we can.
I understand. That's why I'm talking about an overlay. Even if you only got 10 years out of some of these side streets, they're not heavily traveled. I mean, even if we did that, it would give some relief to some of these streets that we may not get at in my lifetime. I'm done.
Question, comment?
Thank you.
I just want to thank Jeff. On Labor Day, I got that email from the resident on Hastings Street, and I contacted Dad through email immediately, and he surprisingly answered me on Labor Day. And you looked at it on Tuesday, and by Wednesday, you had already put all the gravel down that needed to be put down. It was already patched up. So it was nice to get a thank you from that resident.
Well, and just like Councilman Zelinski's saying, we're very aware of where those streets are at. I'm very concerned on how do we plow it, how do we maintain it, how do you street sweep it, because they are getting so bad, and there's not a solution for all of those right now.
Before we go on, take
Thank you.
Move on to item E, discussion on ordinance 18-08, chapter 1060, garbage and rubbish collection and disposal. It was tabled from 8/21/18. Open for discussion.
Well, as you brought up a minute ago, maybe it's a good idea to have an ad hoc committee and go with it.
Hey, yeah, I just mentioned that to Councilmember Goodspeed, that, you know, with the diversity of input that we're getting, now that this has come up, I mean, both from the Vogue Theater, downtown merchants, from residents, and some of the concerns I expressed at the ordinance committee, this may be something that's appropriate to put an ad hoc committee together and get a general consensus, so we could do an ordinance that applies to the city in general as opposed to just the downtown district. And I'd be interested in what people's thoughts are on that process.
I think it's a good idea.
Yep. Definitely.
Solve the whole problem.
I think it's all our problem. It's everybody's problem. We need to resolve it that way.
Mr. Taylor?
That's a great option. Just, how would you like, you know, do you want staff to give you recommendations for the committee? Do we want to advertise? How would you like to have that
I think
ad hoc
that's
committee populated?
Give us some downtown residents, give us some, or factors.
Would you be interested in serving on that?
Bob,
Huh? Would you be interested? In serving on an ad hoc committee for the rubbish?
Really not the way I feel at all.
Okay.
I mean, you know, if you have, I mean, people that have a concern, I would say,
I'll bring council some recommendations. How many would you like on the committee?
5.
5. Yeah, you
5?
know more than
5, no more than 5.
I'm willing to be on it.
Okay.
how many?
The vote be on it and.
5.
5 members.
Yeah, Jim spoke up at the meeting. I think that
So,
gets him an invite. Right, Jim?
And then Grabowski wants to be on it.
Mr. Taylor, with Councilmember Grabowski wishing to be on the committee,
Okay.
let him run it.
All right, I got 2 out of the 5, so I'll bring you back 3 more.
Thank you.
I know who doesn't want to be on it.
There's a DDA meeting.
Can I guess?
Meeting tomorrow. I know Nicole down at the Fillmore has been pretty vocal about it.
And then you got one person.
I would give you an even better one. I think he's going to be out of town for a week, but Lane down at Memory Lanes has taken it upon himself to try and keep that whole corner clean and part of the Riverwalk down there. He's expressed some real concerns to me. He's not a city resident, but he is the business owner and
Right.
vendor down there.
Yeah, I'll try to bring back something that represents the entire city.
Okay?
Okay.
There's a residence.
So he's probably.
Residents or property owners?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not part of the River Street.
I would imagine that takes care of that item.
Sounds like we got it covered.
How do we handle on the agenda? Do we have to vote the motion?
Can't.
Because we tabled it, do we have to do anything at the next?
At the next meeting, we'll have to bring up the first
Meeting would
original
Have an
motion.
item to,
Then
We'll put it on,
as an ad hoc.
we'll put it on, because it was tabled, we'll bring it back, and then you can take the action of establishing the ad hoc committee.
Okay? Thank you.
Was that the, we had an original motion?
Item F,
That was sidewalks.
discussion on ordinance 18-09, chapter 1024, sidewalks, animals, says on Riverwalk, tabled from the 8/21/18 agenda. This one's open for discussion.
On the process. Excuse me, sorry, we're getting this other finalized.
Well, I'm the one that's kind of threw the monkey wrench in it. I don't see there to be a problem in the wider sections of the Riverwalk, Marina, almost behind the Bluefish, that area. Why you shouldn't be allowed to have your dog, walk your dog. I don't understand. That's the main, well, because that's the main area of downtown. One, it gets, people don't walk, if they're gonna walk their dog downtown, it gets them off downtown. Then they can go up and walk down to the beach. I don't have an issue. I have an issue with when it gets down to like 3 feet wide. I have an issue with that. Last I knew, DDA offered to put bags in. So I think just to limit it, we're eliminating a lot of people's. I couldn't believe how big of a hot top this was until the day before. And then we're not pet friendly, we're not, that's my.
I just can't buy that argument. We're not pet friendly. There isn't any place in this city you can't take your animals, including designated areas on the beach. And due to safety concerns, and concerns I get from a lot of people that like to walk on the Riverwalk or jog on the Riverwalk, they do not like to encounter dogs on the Riverwalk. It's been signed that way for, I don't know when the signs went up, but it's pedestrian traffic only, no animals are allowed. And I think the original issue was that it's tough to enforce that because then you have to go back to the ordinance that says that you have to obey posted signs as opposed to a specific ordinance prohibiting that. I think one of the things that we do need to consider is with our boater traffic at the marina, we need to come up with some literature or some way to inform those people how they can get from their boat to areas that would facilitate them walking their animals and stuff that they bring with them. I notice a lot of those people that come in boats bring their dogs with them. So I just, you got some railing and you don't have some railings, and yes, there are wide portions of the Riverwalk. I'm down there a lot. Mayor Pro Tem and I were down there standing on the deck of the Elks, and there's a jogger coming down, and there's a person coming the other way with a large dog, and dog jumping up. There was another person there. The jogger exited the Riverwalk to go up on River Street as opposed to encounter the dog, and that was an intentional move. And I think, what do you want to do on the Riverwalk? To say we're not dog friendly because we don't let dogs go absolutely everywhere, I think is a misrepresentation.
I agree.
I think if-
Please down at the Riverwalk where they keep the boarders can get off and when their dogs.
Yeah, well, I think, they have bicycles and stuff on there too, it's just kind of an information thing. When a boater comes in, hand them a little brochure and say, okay, dogs aren't allowed on the Riverwalk, but here's where you can go by the Elks and go up, or you can go over by the marina and go up and access River Street.
I won't say. You come back real soon with your dog. Oh, no, don't come with your dog.
I think it's hard though, if you're just gonna limit one area of the Riverwalk, like how, you have to really enforce it then. You'll have to have signs.
It'd be an enforcement nightmare, I think.
We're not able to really enforce what's happening on the Riverwalk now. There are people walking dogs, there are people riding bicycles. It's to say that we can't restrict it on one area is kind of silly because, only to me probably, but because we haven't been able to control what's happening on it now.
Jeff, do we have barrels down there for the people that throw their waste in them, for the dogs and that, if they walk them on River Street?
We have trash cans, but not specifically for animals.
I've seen people clean up and use the trash cans, and I've seen people just walk off, so.
Well, I called Dial-A-Ride because I was curious how they handle dog issues on their bus. Dial-A-Ride allows lap dogs, no problem. If it's a big dog, it has to be muzzled. So they've learned through past experience that bigger dogs need to be muzzled or need to be under some different rules. With that being said, Traverse City's holding a big 5K run or something this weekend, and they're inviting all their people to bring all their dogs with them while they run. I don't know where that middle ground is. I'm having trouble with it. Would I take my dog on the boardwalk? Absolutely not. And he's pretty friendly, but I just wouldn't do it. I guess the thing that bothers me the most is that if I allow dogs on the boardwalk, am I gonna feel responsible if a child is permanently disfigured because of a dog bite? I don't know. It can happen really quick. They're animals, they act on instinct, not a thought process. So I don't know.
It could happen on a sidewalk, too.
Sure it could.
Are we gonna, what if somebody brings their comfort dog on the Riverwalk? Are we gonna tell them they can't bring their dog on there? Now we're violating their civil rights.
I didn't hear the first part. What'd you say?
What about a comfort dog?
I would think service dogs have to be handled differently. Actually, service animals.
I think they're covered by state law.
I think they're by state and federal laws, both, yeah.
So where do we want to go with this?
I think we should do what we did in the ordinance committee. Go along with the ordinance we came up with, no dogs in a river.
Okay.
I would like to see if we can just allow them to follow the plan that the DDA director suggested and have the DDA give us a hand with that segment of the Riverwalk where they want to put bags for the dogs.
So are we looking at a safety issue or a poop issue?
Both.
Well, the area that the DDA wanted was a wide section. It wasn't a narrow section, so.
Is that enforceable, Tim?
Not until we actually pass an ordinance.
But I mean, once we pass the ordinance, is that something that could be enforced?
Certainly, if it's outlined in the ordinance, correct.
If we just had a portion of the boardwalk?
No parking in this area, yeah, it's the same thing as by ordinance.
I tell you what makes it tough is that when you see somebody violating an ordinance, say no dogs on the Riverwalk, and you try to approach them to tell them that we have a rule that says no dogs on the Riverwalk, that's where we get the reputation of being not dog-friendly. And I can see there's great reluctance from people to say that to anybody.
If we go along with having just a portion, I would think we would need signs and all that, so who's paying for that?
Oh, how much does a sign cost to make?
Is the city gonna have to go and?
Less than $100 each with the post and the sign itself, probably $60, I'd say.
Well, that's what we did down at First Street. They carved out a section where dogs were allowed.
Right.
And they posted it.
So if we do the ordinance, I think we need to do something.
Well, that's a given, yeah, we have to.
But then what about bicycles, skateboards, that type of thing?
There's already a sign, isn't there?
Well, it says no dogs with it.
We'll put a piece of tape over it, okay?
Well, no, I'm saying I don't think we have to deal with it because that's already up.
But I still don't want to see the bicycles and skateboards and stuff on the Riverwalk at all. So, I mean, it is a pedestrian walking a dog down there is one thing, but even the wide areas aren't suitable for that when you've got a lot of traffic.
I would agree with you on that. I don't really like encountering skateboards or bicycles when I'm down there walking. I don't know if they're gonna stop or what side of the walkway I have to jump to.
My recommendation would be to bring this back at the next council meeting and then direct staff and the city attorney to prepare the proper ordinance language.
Okay?
Because right now, what we have proposed prohibited dogs, bicycles, skateboards, and rollerblades. So if council wants to thinks otherwise now, you can direct staff and the city attorney to come back with some different language.
Could come back like with designated area as marked or
Yeah.
something?
Yeah.
It'd be easy to put a sign when you get down to the narrow portion of the Riverwalk that says no dogs past this point. I
So-
mean,
So we'll put this on the agenda for the next meeting, and then you can give the staff and city attorney the proper direction.
thank you. Everybody okay with that?
Yep.
Okay. We now move on to the other category. Mr. Taylor, do you have anything for us?
Nothing at this time.
City Clerk?
Nothing at this time.
CFO?
Nothing more.
Public Works?
Nothing, Your Honor.
City Engineer?
Nothing, Your Honor, unless,
Roger's question is coming. Where we at?
Just want to upstage me all the time.
I just will hit one major item. We met with MDQ yesterday, and Jeff can elaborate on a little more too, but we met for 2 hours, and I think it was a very productive meeting. We talked about the basis of design, a lot of small items they want us to fine tune in our reports and our analysis, but I don't see anything that's really major that would shift any of our recommendations right now, so that's good for us to move forward with design. We also discussed, and Jeff was very to the point with the DEQ, saying you've put some very restrictive deadlines on us. We're going to expect that in return when we do our submittals. We would like some timeframes when you're going to review and get back to us, because we have to put this out for bid in less than about a half a year, and a typical design review could take 2 to 3 months just by itself. So we're really asking them to keep that concise, give us some deadlines, and it's going to work into an overall schedule, and they've committed to putting in writing. So we're looking to see that, hopefully see that very soon. So that was good. There's a ton of work to be done, but at least we know we're going probably in the right direction.
We're ahead of the schedule at this point.
You just jinxed yourself.
Thank you. Public Safety? Pockets full of change now.
Put that chest out there.
Pockets full of change.
Well, I'd first like to commend Jeff for the wonderful job he did today on his presentation. Thank you. As you're well aware, you've commented that we've awarded our AFG grant, our Assistance Firefighters Grant, which is really no money out of the pockets of the city taxpayers. The matching funds was authorized, through the revenue sharing that we do up with the tribe. So looking forward to getting that actually finalized and getting that official word and the money deposited so we can go forward with our bidding for our equipment and get that in. We can start getting it on our truck. So I think it's good news.
Thank you.
Congratulations, good job.
Member Ford?
Still got 15 minutes.
No, we don't. No.
Well, Jeff had 15 minutes more.
Good, thank you.
You're good. Okay.
Do you have anything?
No,
No?
that's enough. I'm tired
Linda?
of talks.
Mayor Smith, I don't know if this is appropriate to ask you this, but if you could check with the DDA and see if they're still interested in maintaining that section.
There's a meeting tomorrow, so.
If you could bring it up, that'd be great. Thank you.
One quick thing. When we had the discussion about defined benefits, defined contribution, we talked about a 10% cap that was in the United Steelworkers contract, and that's no longer law. Was that ever removed? Is it null and void? Is it?
Still remains part of their contract.
Is there a reason why we wouldn't remove it, or is it?
Because it's part of the agreement, and neither party has agreed to remove it.
Kind of irrelevant.
Nope.
Jeff, what did they ever decide on those boxes, consumer or Bell Telephone boxes or something? Did you ever get a hold of them? There's one on 12th Street, there's different ones around town that are wide open.
I have not reached them.
Okay. Because they're still sitting.
Councilmember Pontiac.
I just had a question about blight. I've gotten a lot of complaints in my district, that there's a lot of overgrown yards and, just structural blight. If Tim, can you go down there? It's mainly 13th and 14th Street through Manistee Street. And then, is there anything being done with the house on 11th Street that caught fire? It's been sitting there for months now. It looks pretty bad.
I know that we had contacted them about boarding it up at least, but don't know anything yet on moving by insurance companies. I know that city is covered as far as our costs, if there's going to be a cost on our end, once they do upgrades or anything like that.
follow through on that, though.